Right, well, welcome to this masterclass, David Booth. Thank you very much for agreeing to present. And we are, without further introduction, going to listen to your presentation on strategy in an age of uncertainty. So thank you very much, David. Over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Over the last 60 years, strategic planning has become really embedded in organizations. There's been so much development, different schools of thought about how to approach it, innovation, the big strategy consultancies have been involved, leading thinkers, really has evolved as a discipline, as thinking as how to do it, as how to, an important element of running an organization and thinking about the future. And yet there are problems with how strategic planning has actually been implemented. Just bear with me a minute, my slides seems to have frozen at the moment. I will just come off screen share and just see we can move forward on that basis. Yeah. Apologies for that. Let me go back to screen share and try and get the format. So the problems that they have with strategic planning that are encountered in actually the practice of how it's done. Many people approach it, and many organizations approach it with this is how you should do it. This is a standardized approach. This is the technique. This is the order you do things. This is what you need to do to develop a strategic plan. There's also a real focus on the document. That's the document that counts. That's the end result. That's what matters. And all the focus of a process is delivering something that the board can champion, that can be waved about to stakeholders and shareholders, appear on the website, etc., as being the end point of a strategic planning process. There's also arguably a lack of expertise in many organizations, where they will bring in experts, external experts, to help them with the process, be they the big consultancies or individuals that have got expertise in strategic planning. But it's something that many organizations don't feel comfortable with taking on board themselves. A fourth area of limitation is a focus on the numbers, and only the numbers. It's the end result, and it's the projections, it's the resources, it's the budget, it's the long-term investment that becomes the real focus of the plan as it's developed and the discussions. And then there's the stereotype of the classic board strategy away days. Take the board away, take the senior management away for a day, a weekend, and back they come to the organization with the tablets of stone and delivering the strategy, and then it's written up and implemented throughout the organization. There's also a decorating problem. Wallpaper and gloss, what do I mean by that? Wallpaper is where the cracks within the organization or the cracks within the thinking are pasted over. Issues not fundamentally resolved. The challenge is to try and get, or the focus is to try and get to an end result of a strategy document that works, that be accepted, rather than probably address and identify the key issues. And there's a gloss aspect as well. How many great graphs, charts, figures, glossy presentations, slick documents can be produced, how many pages, and the measure of the success is and how good that is. SWOT and PEST, dogs and cows. This is where the techniques are what dominates the process. We have to do a SWOT. We have to do a pestle analysis about the environment. Let's do a McKinsey matrix or BCG matrix and looking at dogs and sacred cows, etc. And it's all about the techniques and the tools rather than actually the issues and the story. And another area, it's a management exercise. It's delivered by and developed by senior management. It's developed, written up, and seldom engaged with others in the organization, both during the process of developing it or afterwards. And the document, the end product, the glossy document, or the files that lie behind it can so often end up on the shelf or propping open a door, not referred to, not used beyond the initial enthusiasm, if you like, and the motivation for having achieved this strategic plan for the document. And perhaps also, most importantly, not carrying out the strategic plan, assuming it will happen. You've developed the plan, you've got the buy-in from the senior level, and therefore, why doesn't it happen in an organization? It needs that focus and it needs that implementation and that focus on implementation, that sustained effort in order to carry it forward. So there's a traditional approach to strategic planning, which is very top-down. It's undertaken periodically, in line often with budgeting process, annual budgeting process. It adopts a very sequential, linear approach, stage by stage, and almost a project approach, where resources are intensively brought together to work it out, to think, to develop, and to get the agreement to the plan. But with the issues and with the fast changing environment in which many organizations are facing today, there's a need for a different approach, a new approach, where people are engaged throughout the organization. There's the ability to develop strategy in an ongoing way. It's responsive. It can react to changes, to things that might change. And it's integral to the work of the organization, not something that's added on. And people in the organization have got the capability to develop their strategy and to see it through and to implement it. So there is a move, and there is a trend and a desire, I think, in many organizations to move to that much more engaged, different, newer, responsive style of undertaking strategic planning. I want to quote an example from many years ago from my own experience. And I can tell you how long ago it was, because it was involved various consultancies coming in with overhead projectors and acetates. And this was when I was working for Smith & Nephew in the early 90s. And there was a new division formed. And the key thing the board said then, the senior management said then, is we need a strategic plan. Bring together different parts of the organization. We need a strategic plan. Did the usual thing and invited the expert local and national consultancies to come and pitch. And several came in with acetates, with detailed week-by-week plans as to what should be achieved then, who should be involved, when we're going to do a SWOT, when are we going to do this analysis, all of that. And then there was somebody called George Binney that came in from Ashridge. And he sat down, and that's all he had. A blank sheet of paper and a pencil. And he said, okay, so tell me what you really want to achieve. And that led to an opening out of discussion. It led to the realization that there were different views as to what was required, and the whole process where that particular division, that new division, went through something totally different from what they expected in order to define and understand their future and how they were going to move forward. And I was at the receiving end of that, and it was so revealing as about what actually is the heart of a strategy and a strategic planning process. And just want to step back now to actually thinking about, from first principles, if you like, what strategy or strategic planning is really all about. And three things, and I'll expand on each of them: perspectives, questions, and conversations. So with perspectives, there is this great diagram, I love this diagram, that Henry Mintzberg produced about the different perspectives and the different levels, if you like, of directions of thinking that you need to consider when developing a strategy. There's obviously the past behind, looking ahead to the future, the helicopter vision above, seeing things, a bigger picture, bigger situation, but also below, being able to delve in to the detail, to get the insights and to get the understanding. There's a need to think beyond as well, what the future might be, not just what it's developing to be, what it might be. And also beside the lateral thinking, different ways of looking at things, different opportunities, different possibilities. And then there's a need to think through the implications and how to implement it, how to carry it forward. So those perspectives are key in how you stretch that thinking to begin to consider a strategic plan. And questions. I think strategic planning, developing a strategic plan, boils down to just 4 questions and answering those. Where are we now? Where do we want to go? How will we get there? And how do we make it happen? And asking questions is the powerful conduit of getting that discussion, that thinking, that development of strategy. Just a couple of other examples. So, for example, answer the question, who do we serve as an organization? How do you define and describe and define your customers? And that can lead to all sorts of investigation, really understanding. And quite often, it leads to insights that help to serve a different view and a better view about how an organization can move its future. Where's the value in? What do we provide value as to how we serve that organization? And what are the skills to enable them to serve them well? And the processes that we undertake, and why do they choose it? So all sorts of questions like that. And another example, products and services from an organization that they're now understanding what they're good at, and what is offered to those customers with those products and with those services. And what might change? How could you build on those strengths and capabilities? And what are the opportunities, and what are the threats, and how could that change? All of these, a standard process is a straightforward process, but it's about questions. It's about answering those questions and answering them with depth and understanding and sharing. That means that is the way in which you can develop a really effective strategy. I think everybody wants to try and understand where they are, what role they play, where their organization is going, making sense of their role, their future, and their organization's future. And this concept of sense making, the process of analyzing, understanding, articulating, understanding, get the real depth of understanding, requires conversations within the organization, the rich conversations, ones that go into the insight, the real depth, the challenge to get the precision and the exact understanding and the language right And that process is really very, very powerful and so important in terms of developing a strategy. And you need that understanding, and you need that agreement, and people to understand not just why, what strategy has been developed, what the plan is, but also why. What's the rationale behind that's led to that thinking? What factors have influenced how this strategy has been produced and articulated? And getting that engagement and getting that ownership, both on a rational understanding basis, but also internally owning it, understanding it, supporting it, and being able to act on it. Having that conversation, investing in that engagement is the way in which you get the organization embracing the strategy and the platform for moving forward. And it's that action, that implementation, that ability, that initiative to act that is key in an effective strategic plan. So, a definition. Strategic planning is how people in an organization make sense of where it's going and how it's going to get there. And that, to me, that making sense, that understanding, that answering the set of the basic questions is the process that you go through to really help to clarify, articulate, and engage, and people to own that understanding about where their organization is going to go and how they can contribute to that as well. So they're able to act in a dynamic way to help that organization get there. And the path isn't straight. You spend all this time in terms of developing an intended strategy, and things change. Things don't happen according to the plan, so things drift. So your realized strategy, your actual strategy is different to that. And then something happens. There's a change in the market that throws you, a competitor action, new regulations that come in, something like that. And out of that, there's a need to adjust. New strategy emerges from the organization. And there's a different path that develops as an intended strategy, but the same thing happens. It's not there, it drifts away, it needs reinforcement to get somewhere back to on track. So the whole process is a journey. The strategy journey is what organizations undertake, and that flexibility to be dynamic and to adapt to it is absolutely key, and to know when to adapt to it. So again, a simple diagram. What is strategic planning about? How people make sense where it's going, how to get there. What's the context of the organization? Where's it now? Where do you want to get to? How do you get there? How do you make it happen? Articulating that, sharing and engaging, and putting it into practice. But the very, very, very important thing on this diagram is that monitor, review, adapt, start again. That ability to react to things happen, to go change, to check things are on track. And it's that cycle, that dynamic cycle, which makes a strategic planning healthy in an organization rather than an imposed or a one-off process. It makes it come alive and be embedded in the organization. So what skills are needed to do this? You've got the strategizing in terms of formulating and developing a strategy. Organizing, how do you plan, how to implement it, how to allocate the resources, what's needed, how do you mitigate against problems and risks, how do you carry that through? But also, you need the leadership to guide, facilitate, make happen those processes. And again, very importantly, it's that learning from people engaging in thinking about this, working through the questions, both individually within the organization and the organization as a whole. That is so powerful as the organization to develop, to enhance and improve its ability to develop its strategy. And there are three building blocks of strategic capabilities that an organization needs in order to be able to successfully adopt this. There's the ability to think strategically, both individual and organizationally. And a bit like the diagram from Henry Mintzberg, all those different perspectives stretch the thinking of what you need to be able to consider strategy and to think strategically. So strategic thinking is the base, both the depth of strategic thinking and the width of that adoption across the organization. The more people are confident about being able to engage and contribute in the conversations that develop and implement strategy, then the stronger the basis to have those conversations and to develop this. Then the strategic management. What are the processes that the organization has to enable and facilitate those sort of conversations? And how do you guide the organization through that process? And how do you help to assess its strategy and how it's going? And the final level, the third level, is strategic leadership. And that's, if you like, the oversight of ensuring the organization develops and implements its strategy effectively. Have people and has the organization got the strategic thinking capabilities? Have they got the right processes? When's the time to review the strategy? How do you make sure you're on track? How do you stimulate and launch a review and reconsider that journey that the organization is on with its strategy? Now, my original background years ago was maths, and this is just for fun, but I just sort of love the formula. So organizational performance is a function of the factors that are within the organization's control and factors outside an organization's control. And wow, hasn't the balance of those shifted quite considerably in the past 6 months? More of that in a few minutes. When you're looking at a good practice, best practice in an organization is to consider your risks of implementing it and how you mitigate them. What's the likelihood of those risks? What the impact? What do you need to do to mitigate them? However, in February of this year, March of this year, the coronavirus 2 impact just put off the scale of that impact, off any scale of what anybody might reasonably have included in their risk management assessment or their consideration of factors to mitigate. Totally blew it all out of the water. And if you consider the different risks, the different likelihood and the ability to control, then this was very much in the outside to control and the not predictable box. And what you need there, and what organizations have found, is the agility to react. You can't prevent or mitigate a risk. You couldn't anticipate COVID-19. You couldn't seek to prevent or mitigate it. It wasn't within your control in terms of how you could necessarily deal with that. You couldn't prepare for it, but you did need to react as an organization. And how organizations react, I think, probably depends both on the circumstances and on their outlook. For many organizations, there's a desire to get back to normal, or the previous normal. And if you're reactive, you're not proactive, the focus there is just simply hoping to survive. If things are happening that are changing the outlook, changing that new normal, then arguably you're either seek to follow and adapt to those trends and try and make sense of it and follow what's happening, or for some organizations, they're looking to anticipate that, to create a different future, to be really proactive in shaping and thinking about how things might be in the future and how they could take it forward. And I suppose your outlook as well depends upon your response depends upon the degree of change that you've got within your market, within your environment, and what's required for the organization. So if you think change is unlikely to be that significant, you're looking to restore what you had before. Whereas more fundamental changes, you need to perhaps reframe how you're looking at the organization, the business, perhaps even reinvent where that business sits. And I've got some questions that could be posed about that in a few slides' time. So there's been some radical thinking required to consider different futures from the ones in which people might have been expecting to be on the radar, on the horizon. How, in an organization, how do you develop the capability and the thinking to help you be able to respond and adapt to that sort of radical change? And the discipline of strategic foresight, I think, is going to become increasingly powerful and important in how organizations can consider their future strategy. This is a chart from Jill Ringland, who's from several years ago, but got real expertise in strategic foresight. And just to explain, the horizon, many organizations in a fairly stable environment would look to project, to predict what's going to happen over the next 2 or 3 years, to forecast what's going to happen. And that will form the basis of their sort of short to medium term planning. As you go out 5 to 10 years hence, the degree of predictability about the future, particularly in these uncertain times, reduces. And the uncertainty increases so considerably. Maybe a few years ago, the horizon was stretched out more. Maybe it was 15 to 20 years. But I think the time horizon and that window is becoming much, much tighter now. So where foresight comes into play, perhaps is between the 3 to 5 years, 3 to 7 years, where you're trying to look at what changes might occur that might be significant, and what futures might the organization have to consider, and how might it respond to them. Now, developing scenarios is, again, quite a skill, quite an attribute that is required by organizations that maybe not a lot of organizations have spent a lot of time doing. It requires thinking through. You've got a view, you've got some assumptions, and to think through and beyond to what the implications of those assumptions might be. And what might it mean for the organization? that requires some considered thinking and some investment of time. And that's quite a skill and an attribute in terms of developing scenarios. Now, strategic foresight isn't, scenario planning isn't just what's involved in strategic foresight. Strategic foresight is arguably a bit more radical than that. It's taking perhaps different axes, different factors of things that might well change. So, for example, what about a virtual only environment compared to a back to the office environment? Everything done online compared to things done face to face in a retail sense. What might those futures be? And developing the stories and the pictures about what that might mean for that scenario. And it's like a mini scenario that you take and develop those that vision, that pictures, and convey them. And then the important thing for that is, well, here's pictures, here's names, here's stories that we have, but what does each of those mean for us, the organization, now? What might we need to do now or build into our thinking to be able to check the signals about whether this particular change is happening, or what might we need to do to be able to prepare for it, either as a contingency or as a likelihood. So thinking that through is important, and integrating it within your strategic management and your strategic planning process is how you bring that into your continual dynamic thinking about what the future might be for the organization, and being prepared to react, to adapt to it, to anticipate, and to know what to do. So it's very much about stretching that strategic thinking, management, leadership capabilities in the organization, embedding them with it, having the culture in the organization as well, that this is the style. We talk strategy, we think strategy, we're comfortable with having those conversations, we're comfortable looking about the future and what might change, and we're prepared to be able to engage, react, think through, adapt, move along our strategy journey, meet that challenge, pass that obstacle, change the course if we need to. And the third aspect of this is the confidence as well. The confidence within the organization to be able to do this, to take it on board, knowing that you've got the ability, knowing that you can talk, you can think, you can work it through. So to me, these are the key components of an approach to strategy that becomes dynamic, agile, and enables organizations to really guide themselves and determine their own strategy journeys and to navigate the challenges that they face and the opportunities successfully. And I'll just close with, so I'll come back to some questions. And to me, answering questions is at the heart of the strategic planning process. So as a suggestion, I won't go through these because they'll be on the slides that come through with the recording of the presentation, but fundamental questions: who are we? What's our purpose? Why do we exist? What are we good at? What can we offer? How do we make it work? What's the business model? Those sort of questions, arguably those that our organizations will have been and will be asking and continuing to ask in order to be able to develop their own understanding and make sense of their own journeys and where they're going to go in uncertain times and how they're going to get there and adapt to the opportunities and the challenges en route. So I hope that's been thought-provoking, and I'm delighted to have some questions and see whether I can answer them as well.
David Booth, thank you very much for that. It has provoked quite a lot of reactions, so there is plenty in the Q&A box. So for anybody who hasn't found the Q&A box, it's the bottom of your screen, and what I'll do is I'll go through these questions, and I will go through them. You might think randomly, I might think logically, and if you think there's some, as an audience a member of the audience, if you think there's some that you really think that should be answered, you can click on the thumbs up, and it will move it to higher up in the list. Right. There's been a couple of questions that I didn't expect to see coming. So things keep moving around. There's one from Julia here about, do you know of examples of practices using artists to work on developing strategic decision, direction and plan? So it's about using different creative techniques in the strategy making process.
Oh, how powerful is that? Great question. The process of making sense, the process of articulating and working out and describing and helping people to understand is so fundamentally important. And whatever tools you've got to do that, to help bring that about, is are really valid. It's quite interesting. In every strategic planning process I've ever been involved with and helped organizations with, there always seems to be one diagram or one chart or one encapsulation, one articulation that really gels with the organization, that they respond to, that sets a framework that people say, yes, that's it, we understand. And it gets people talking and leads it through. So yes, using artists, using tools, using visual tools, using diagrams, mind maps to help understanding. It's about that understanding, whatever is there. It is not about going to a textbook and picking out a tool unless that tool is helpful in the articulation.
No, thank you. I thought that was just an interesting question. It was high up on the list as well, so I thought I would go to there. There's one from Hector that's high up on the list. It's currently the second one down. I've clicked on it. What are the questions that the question is? What are the questions that people in charge of strategic planning will need to ask their organizations to survive? So I think that chimes very much with your top-down, bottom-up look at the area.
Yeah, I think to answer that, it depends very much on the organisation and its circumstances, and I suppose hence the last few slides, if you like, as to where an organisation is on the spectrum of changes that are likely to impact on it and its own circumstances in terms of its finance, its health, its markets, its future prospects. And I think that's probably why I put some of the questions down in that last slide as well, because sometimes they can be, sometimes it can be important in that situation to re-examine the purpose of the organisation. If a market, if a need, if the way in which you've traditionally served your customers, clients, whatever has changed, and yet you understand your strengths, your capabilities, your attributes, what you offer and what's of value, then maybe argue, what's your purpose? What's driving you? Then maybe that's a way in which those are the sort of questions that you can ask to reframe or reinvent how you position yourself in the new environment in which you're faced.
I'm scrolling down the questions here, and I'm going to jump around, and I'm not going to take you to specific ones, but there seems to be quite a healthy debate about and suggestions around having conversations. And there's a suggestion from Steve about there's Simon Heath on Twitter is a good person for developing capturing the discussion visually. And then further down in this list, there's people suggesting about getting people relaxed and using Lego. And I just think that there's some really interesting, things to work through to get to the end, and getting people to relax and getting people engaged in things. So,
yes. Can I, sorry, before you ask the question, just to comment on that.
Yeah.
Relaxing, developing a strategy is a serious business. It's obviously there's so much at stake, so it's not to take it lightly. But stepping back, creating the space to have the conversations, allowing and enabling that discussion and that, I don't know, working through to get the answers is so important, because that leads to a better, more solid understanding that people then can respond to. And again, there's a tendency. And there's a tendency to say we must have a strategic plan in this period of time. We've got to have, this is the process. We need to move on. If you've wallpapered over the cracks or not addressed the issues, there's a weakness there that, in due course, may come to, it's the glossing over of that may limit the organization's real ability to respond. Sorry, Peter, that was just to say, create the space, create the time, have the conversations.
No, and I think that's interesting, that relax, create the space, but there's a destination in mind. Right, so there's a question at the top that I've clicked on from Masood on, do you think leaders and organizations can develop clarity on where are you going, particularly if the intended strategy in a pandemic, Volker would take people with you on that journey? So for those unaware of the acronym Volker, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So I thought I'd delay whilst you had to think about that. So it's about some clarity on where we're going.
It's interesting, if I'm interpreting the question right, perhaps there isn't clarity on where the organization's going. Perhaps because of the degree of uncertainty, there isn't a defined future or totally crystallized, precise goal. However, in the strategy development conversations, you might develop that as such as you need the flexibility to respond. You've articulated, so if you like, perhaps a purpose or what you're good at and what are the core capabilities. You might have identified the opportunities, and maybe your strategy at this time is to have that openness and that ability to be able to go on that journey with your understanding in place, with your awareness in place, and to be able to adapt as you go around that next corner, or as over the top of the hill, the next horizon becomes clear, whatever the analogy it is. It's about equipping yourselves in order to navigate the situation that you're in and the path that develops. And maybe that's, I hope I'm answering the question, but rather than maybe having a defined future, picking an option and going for it when things might change, it's about having sufficient articulation of the direction or a knowledge about where roughly you'd like to go, but having the flexibility to adapt to that. I hope that's answered the question.
We'll see what comes up in the I think what is interesting is you're talking about knowing where you're going, and there's been discussion about conversation, and I've highlighted, I've lost his name now, Mark has got a question about, well, you've relaxed people, you've engaged them in a process, you've got a conversation going on. But do you have ideas about handling disagreement in the organization about the strategic planning? So you almost alluded to it there. There's different options, and there might be some fundamental disagreements about which way to go.
Yes, and that's that's not uncommon. The Smith and Nephew experiences I referred to earlier. One of the things that came out of that was very different views from members of the executive team about how they saw things and how they saw the future strategy. And as an example, much of the process that was then embarked upon by that division wasn't about, let's do an environmental analysis, let's do a SWOT, etc. It was about resolving and understanding those personal differences and different viewpoints and resolving that. So again, in answer to the question, fundamental differences have to be resolved. And they have to be resolved with, I suppose, with a rational approach, but they also have to be resolved with a people approach, because it may be different values lie underneath there. It may be disagreements about some of the assumptions that people are making or how people see themselves. But it's shared. A successful strategy is, the degree of success in the strategy is how much that vision, that strategy is shared, is how much that understanding about where the organization is heading is commonly understood, and people are talking that language and understand why that's been developed and buy into that. So those disagreements do need to be resolved, even if it becomes a side camp, if you like, to the progressing on that journey. So important.
I'm going to try and keep on some sort of theme here about knowing where the destination is, and disagreements and engaging with people. And I have lost it down in the thick of all these questions, but Anne has asked quite low down in the list about dealing with organizational chaos and abandonment of familiar strategies. So you talked in the presentation about being flexible and you're changing, but are some of those changes going to be perceived or actually driving chaos in the organization? And how do you deal with that in that 1 minute the organization said it was doing this and now it's changed its mind? That's the perception.
And that's where, and what a shock that many organizations have had, frankly, obviously over the last few months. And it's not to underestimate the impact and the seriousness of that on the people that are in those organizations. It's very, very challenging, very difficult. As are other crises as well, but this is quite quite significant and quite fundamental. I think the key thing is that people need to understand, and you need to take time, invest time in helping people to understand why the organization has changed direction, why there's been a need. It's that making sense bit. It's that journey of that making sense, not just about articulating something or the analysis that leads to it, but it's actually about the real understanding of why those decisions have been taken. And that takes time and consideration of people to explain and to help them to realize why that change has occurred. That investment in time in people is so, so important.
And I'm going to keep on this theme. There's a question from Bob that's been at the top, but I wanted to work my way and meander around to getting to it. So Bob is asking a question about, if I summarize it, it's saying, well, you've got a rational process, but it's going to drive anxiety in people. And do you have any lessons or insights on this human side of the strategic planning, particularly around settling people and removing that anxiety that it's the right thing to do, that it's okay to change, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, change. Change. People can fear change a lot. Obviously, they can be apprehensive about change, the understanding about what it means for them. All the change management, if you like, reactions that you have that you need to address as an organisation. I think I'd come back to, I guess it's caring for people in a sense. And I suppose that's the approach as well. If you value people in your organisation and you want their commitment, you want their wholehearted commitment behind things. And it's an approach that, different organisations have different cultures, different styles, etc. But if you really want to embed an understanding, to take the time to explain, to help people through that, then you stand much more chance of success in people understanding, even if they don't, sort of fully agree at the end, whatever, at least they understand and you've taken the time to explain how you've got that decision. So I would just say that, people are at the heart of strategy. It's not about techniques. It's not about numbers. It's not about documents, whatever. It's people's understanding about where it's going, and understanding in a way in which they can act on it. They can act on that strategy. They can use it as a platform, not just, they can refer back, if you like, to remind. It's a continual process. That's the way in which you get this dynamic flow of conversation. I hope that helps to answer it anyway.
For me, it does. We'll see what comes up in the Q&A. I'm going to pick two. They're on a theme here, and there's one from Alison and one from Hector that, from my perspective, are at the top of the list, about scenario planning and strategic planning. And you've got such unpredictable times, such an uncertain environment. What's the future of both? And should we just concentrate on being agile and able to respond very quickly? You alluded to, well, a lot of people had to very, very quickly earlier on in this year. So, there's these tools that you presented, lots and lots of people use, lots of organizations use. So, is there a role for them, or is it just not at this time?
I think there's a role for tools that help people to clarify, understand, or articulate where they might be. So those tools, the tools can vary. They can be diagrams, they can be analyses, etc. They can be SWOT analysis, whatever. But it's so there's a role for tools, but strategic planning. I find the term strategic planning very. It's a little bit cold in a sense. It's this sort of technical process, or it has the impression of a technical process. But I can't find a better word apart from this making sense and going on the strategy journey to help this organization. So I think the way I would look at it is that the traditional way of doing a strategic plan as a project approach, coming out with the tablets of the document, if you like, and going through it, that's probably gone. And it's probably gone for good. That's not to say that you don't need a document. It doesn't have to be long. You don't need something in which to capture that thinking, capture those conversations, help people distill that the direction the organization is going, the vision about it. and help people to be able to refer back to that. You need that in the process, but it becomes a live process, and the adaptation of that to different circumstances becomes, I think, the way in which strategy gets developed and implemented in organizations in the future. Much more dynamic, much more integral to the ongoing way in which organizations talk, think, act, than this top-down, aside once in a year or every 2 years project.
I am looking frighteningly at the time and the number of questions, and I'm sadly going to have to say we haven't got time to answer anymore. And I wanted to go on to some next questions about the extremes of adaptation and survival. But I think I'll have to close it because we've been going too long. It's fantastic having you here, David. You've provoked so many questions, so many suggestions, and some really interesting breadth, unforeseen from my point of view, breadth in some of the questions. So thank you very much for coming and presenting. So yeah.
No, thank you, and thanks for all the questions from participants. It's really stimulating. Thank you.